There's a time-honored tradition in American sports. The huge named athlete, your LeBron Jameses, your Tom Brady's, your Wayne Gretzky's, they reach the end of their contract. SportsCenter, the Twitterverse, your local sports page, they're all captivated around where this player will sign and for how much. Rumors fly, numbers get crunched, and depending on whether or not you're on the winning side, hearts get broken. Cleveland fans were literally burning LeBron jerseys in the street about a decade ago.
This is free agency, and it's got something for everybody. Wildly structured contracts for the GM fantasy nerds. It's got crazy zeros on the end of a dollar figure for people to gawk at, and some of them have huge implications down the line. Just check out SB Nation's channel for great deep dives on that. I'm currently kept awake at night wondering if Shohei Ohtani's next contract will start with a 5 or a 6. Like $500 or $600 million. It's a great opportunity for a worker to get paid what they really deserve, to play where they want, and have some control over their future. They hold all the cards at the dealing table.
But it wasn't always that way. Players didn't always get a say in their destiny and where they would play. Actually, they had zero control over where their professional lives progressed. We get to look at baseball to lead the way here, as it often has in American history. Yep, another baseball video for all 136 of you who watched our Jose Canseco video.
If you're American, then you know Jackie Robinson, one of the greatest athletes on and off the field, breaking baseball's color barrier in 1947. He's the most important athlete in American history. But you know that story, you've heard it 1,000 times. If you really know your history, you might also know about Moses Fleetwood Walker, a black man who played in professional baseball all the way back in the 19th century. Satchel Paige, Josh Gibson, all those players were incredible, and they're worthy of being remembered. Check out our Negro Leagues primer for more on that.
But there's one player that seems to have dropped out of the collective sports consciousness. He's not in Cooperstown, there aren't children's books written about him, his number isn't even retired. And he might just be the second most important athlete in any sport in American history behind Jackie. You can thank him for making free agency, the drama around LeBron or Gretzky, and those $600 million contracts possible. And his name was Curt Flood.
Flood is up, with Maxwell still on third. Greatest defensive center fielders in baseball, Curt Flood. Curt Flood.
A well-paid play, but nonetheless a play.
And Maxwell scores the game's first run.
Before we get to Curt, we need to understand how professional baseball was run for more than 100 years. The head honcho of the MLB is called the commissioner. Currently, he's a lawyer from New York named Rob Manfred. Teams are all owned by someone, a billionaire executive who sets the tone and strategy for how the franchise is run. We often think of the commissioner as someone who's tasked to grow the game and arbitrate, but in reality, he's hired by and for the owners of professional baseball and works with their best interests in mind. The owners have deep, deep pockets and exert extreme control over the game. In the middle part of the last century, the owners were just millionaires back then, but they were all powerful. Back then, free agency was a totally foreign concept.
Consider the robber barons of the Industrial Revolution, and you won't be far off. They were accustomed to absolute control. And looking back, MLB insiders often framed the owners as a fraternity of drinkers, all looking out for each other to keep their bottom lines fat, at the expense of anyone and everyone else. MLB ownership had a legal monopoly on professional baseball. How is this possible? Well, when the Supreme Court first ruled on whether or not baseball was subject to antitrust laws, professional baseball didn't qualify. This was decided in 1922, when the farm system really hadn't been invented, radio broadcasts of games were in their infancy, and baseball just didn't have enough interstate commerce to be broken up. It probably made sense in the first part of the 20th century, but things had changed so much by the time our story picks up. The general managers and owners conducted themselves and colluded in a way that was mutually beneficial only for them, Pretty much everyone in the sphere of the baseball world was tasked with making money for the owners. Managers, reporters, industry people, and they frequently made that money by throwing players under the bus.
By the 1960s, baseball was all over television, and that TV revenue had risen more than 40% in the last few years. 4 expansion teams would soon add to that river of money. The owners had refused an increase to the players' pension program. Owners had refused to lower their requirements to receive the pension. Only about 40% of players typically reached the mark to receive benefits. Owners instituted the Rule 5 draft, which, simply put, meant that teams could draft each other's players. If a player had been in the minor leagues for 3 years and was not yet on the 40-man roster of a major league team, he was eligible to be drafted by other teams. Somewhat cruelly, teams would work out parking deals with each other, in which a player would be drafted, their life moved and upended to a new team. In the spring, the club that received the player would get a small payment from the original team and just send him back. The player was essentially a short-term rental. This was just day-to-day business for the teams, but it was a brutal prank on the players, and they operated with complete disregard to the impact on the player's life and their family.
Even the baseball card deals with Topps were extremely slanted away from people they featured on the front of the card. Players would sign deals to give Topps exclusive rights to their image for just $5 when they entered the minors. Topps would assign a liaison to teams to keep players happy, sending them free transistor radios and patio furniture to keep the eyes off the fact that they were screwing the players. Executives went to great lengths to assert control over their stars. New York Yankees executive George Weiss apparently countered Mickey Mantle's request for a raise with a report from a detective that Weiss had hired to follow Mantle around and gather dirt. Mantle was coming off a Triple Crown season in 1957. I mean, it's 1950s Mickey Mantle. He deserved the money. But the Yankees threatened to tank his image in the eyes of the public. The racket knows no bounds.
The narrative in the sports pages often reinforced the owners' views. Sports writers and insiders were dependent on the teams for access and information, so they parroted the narrative of greedy, pampered players throwing a fit. I mean, you still hear stuff like that today, like, "Shut up and play!"
From the players' side, things were bleak. They had made some progress in getting their share of the game's profits, but not much. Shepherded through by union executive Marvin Miller, players had their minimum salary increased to $10,000. Spring training pay was raised from $25 a week to $40, and players got first-class accommodations when traveling. I mean, that is, if you are a white player. Black players often had to find housing far from spring training and drive further to restaurants and laundromats that would serve them. Other than some modest raises, players really lacked any control over their destinies. Players were barred from using an agent to negotiate their contracts.
Perhaps most famously, the owners included what was called the reserve clause in their contracts from the early days of baseball, which essentially gave owners complete control over their players' careers. The clause stipulated that at the end of a player's contract, the owners could always tack on another year for at least 80% of what they paid the athlete the last year. That player was then bound to that team for life, suppressing competition and artificially keeping salaries low. You could not go out and test the market to see what you were really worth. Sure, you might have been a star to the kids who came to the game for a chance to catch a home run ball, but to the league bosses, you were essentially chattel.
St. Louis Cardinals owner and beer magnate August Anheuser Gussie Busch Jr. was one of these owners. Reading about him feels like you're reading about an evil cartoon character. Ewing Kaufman, owner of the Kansas City Royals, described the way Gussie lived his life as an old feudal lord. Busch used beer and baseball as a business combo to kindle an absolutely booming business for each. The size of his breweries were doubling, and the value of his team was skyrocketing. He named the stadium after himself. He was a paternalistic owner who saw himself as a benefactor to his employees. If you played the game, he wanted you to play.
Curtis Charles Flood was born in 1938 in Houston, Texas, but he grew up in Oakland, California, the youngest of 6 children. Curt's childhood was really filled with in-betweens. He was somewhat sheltered from the racial heat of the Deep South, but his family still moved neighborhoods to escape hostility. As he said himself, we were not poor, but we had nothing. We ate at regular intervals, but not much. Other black ball players are often noted for channeling any frustration and around dehumanization into sports. Jackie Robinson is probably the most prominent of them, but Curt's childhood was as much artistic as athletic. He was a skilled artist who created backdrops for school plays and decor for school dances. He brought his ukulele to spring training. Flood later painted St. Louis Cardinals owner August A. Bush Jr., John F. Kennedy, and Martin Luther King. The portrait of MLK was given to Coretta Scott King, who years later gave it to President George W. Bush. It hung in the White House. Teammates called him Rembrandt. He managed a painting and photography studio while he played in St. Louis. Flood would say, "Baseball and painting make a good balance. Baseball is virile, it's rough and tough. Painting is sensitive, it's quiet, it's an outlet to overcome tension."
We bring this up because only looking at Curt Flood's baseball reference page is an incomplete story. He saw himself as much, much more than a ball player. Flood batted .293 in his lifetime, was a crucial part of St. Louis's 1964 championship as their center fielder, notched 211 hits that same year, and won 7 consecutive Gold Gloves. He was one of the best defensive center fielders in the game, and frequently played more than 150 games in a season. He showed up for his team. Despite this, he was subjected to indignity after indignity.
As he arrived in the minors, his first long stint in the South as an adult, racial hostility found him quickly. His widow tells the story that the first time he saw water fountains marked white and colored, he briefly hoped that one dispensed club soda and the other cola. He was often not allowed to get dressed with his teammates and instead changed in a shed next to the field. When he celebrated a win with his teammates and they had all thrown their dirty jerseys in a pile, a clubby screamed at him, picked up his jersey not by hand, but with a broomstick with a nail in the end of it. Curt was humiliated and none of his teammates even noticed. It clearly weighed on him. His Cardinal roommate Bob Gibson said that he would wake up at 4 a.m. and Curt would be sitting on the edge of his bed, smoking, deep in thought.
Flood experienced similar vitriol that Jackie Robinson and other black players have spoken extensively about. Often, some cities were worse than others. The same month he won the '64 World Series, he signed a lease to move the Flood family to the Bay Area, but a racist real estate agent threatened to hold the house hostage with a shotgun to keep them from moving in. It was racial violence literally at his doorstep.
In spite of all this, Curt had slowly worked to turn himself into somewhat of a St. Louis treasure. His photography and portrait studio was well known in the city. He was a well-liked player, especially by Gussie Bush, our beer overlord from earlier. After all, the oil painting that Flood had given Bush of the owner in the captain's hat hung in the executive's yacht. Flood would rather quit than play somewhere else. He loved St. Louis, and the people embraced him over his decade or so there. It didn't take long for that to turn around, though. At the end of the 60s, Curt had asked for more money from the Cardinals family to help pay for alimony and child support for his ex-wife. Gussie Bush did not appreciate that request.
On the field, Flood made one mistake. In Game 7 of the 1968 World Series, at the end of maybe the finest pitching season of all time, courtesy Bob Gibson, the score sat 0-0 in the top of the 7th. Detroit's Jim Northrup roped a line drive into center field, and Flood lost sight of the ball off the bat. He got a bad jump, slipped in the mud while changing directions, and 2 runs scored. Detroit won the game. At the end of the post-game interview, Flood finished by saying,
"You're coming back next year."
Of course we are. We'll see you the same time right here next year.
he did not know that the next year would be his last. A request for a raise and a bad jump on a line drive was all it took for Curt to lose all his value in Gussie Bush's eyes.
Flood was traded to Philadelphia on October 7th, 1969, just after the season ended. His 12-year Cardinal career was over. Did he get a call from Bush to let his all-star Gold Glove longtime outfielder know that he had been traded? Nope. Did Cardinals GM Bing Devine call to inform him of the move? Nope. Some random front office worker called, spoke to a stunned and silent Flood, and hung up. You're going somewhere else to a dilapidated ballpark with one of the most historically acrimonious fan bases in sports, and there is nothing you can do about it. The last dozen years do not matter. It did not sit well that there was nothing Flood could do. He decided to change that.
What could Flood do? His contract contained the same reserve clause paragraph that everyone else's did, binding him to whatever his team did for life. That didn't sit right with him. He was owned by the Cardinals. He was basically their property. The baseball owners had run their teams this way for over 100 years, and by 1970 had crushed every attempt to challenge their authority. It had all been fought out in the courts more than half a century earlier. Many players would privately support Curt in his upcoming fight, but real change would be tough. Even as MLB Players Association Director Marvin Miller made inroads with players, scabs like Jim Palmer crossed picket lines when players would hold out for better conditions. The status quo was that you get paid a lot of money to play a game, so you get no say whatsoever.
Curt Flood took issue with this. Shortly after being traded, he landed in Marvin Miller's office, fully ready to tank his career and image to give current and future players the option to choose. He was going to sue baseball. Flood called it
It's been a master and slave relationship.
This isn't just a comparison. Flood began by literally claiming that baseball was violating the 13th Amendment. After all, were there any other jobs where you could be literally sold to another owner with no input or consent? He was peppered with questions concerning his $90,000 paycheck, and he would respond that
A well-paid slave is nonetheless a slave.
it upset a lot of people. Flood framed his case not just as an antitrust case or a labor case, but as civil rights. Now, Muhammad Ali and the NBA's Bill Russell were both high-profile athletes and civil rights icons, and Flood had none of that cultural currency. Prominent voices were mad. You got the Civil Rights Act, and you got the Voting Rights Act, and now you want more? Owners framed the issue as Curt Flood attacking the ever-so-precious pastime. Curt Flood was coming to kill baseball itself.
Flood sued Major League Baseball. As he ran his case up to the Supreme Court, he was markedly alone. As the trials went on, not a single ball player would show up to the proceedings. Not a single teammate would speak out publicly in support of Flood. The game abandoned him. It served to make Curt look like a greedy rogue in the media. He began to drink heavily and drained his savings by foregoing playing. He was able to sign a contract for the Washington Senators for the lone fact that he could get a paycheck. But his mind and his efforts were in the courts. He played only 13 games for Washington.
The owners repeatedly asked to have the case dismissed. Not a single player testified with Flood. The owners argued falsely that baseball just simply could not exist without the reserve clause, citing the very chaotic state of very early baseball in the 1870s, insisting that the game would simply fall apart. Pharmaceutical mogul and aforementioned Royals owner Ewing Kaufman testified against Curt, but he made one glaring mistake while on the stand. He was asked what he would pay Flood on the open market, and he admitted he would probably have to shell out at least $125,000 a year, even more if Curt wanted to sign long term. He said the quiet part out loud. The purpose of the reserve clause was to prevent the wealthy owners from paying players what they were worth. Curt lost narrowly. His case was defeated in the Supreme Court in 1972. He couldn't go back to baseball, and he was forgotten promptly. I even found a New York Times article published only 4 years later that refers to Flood as baseball's forgotten man. The crushingly defeated and depressed Flood escaped to Europe for a short while, where he owned a bar and he worked laying carpet occasionally. Flood's drinking continued to be a problem.
After a few years, he returned to Oakland and may or may not have attempted to take his own life. After the decision, Gussie Busch's life remained turbulent to the point of being ousted from the boardroom by his own son in 1975. Players Association exec Marvin Miller did not stop here and rode the momentum of Curt Flood's case. Before the end of the 70s, Miller had worked to secure an arbitrator to settle disputes that wasn't the commissioner of baseball. Players finally had someone who wasn't going to side with the ownership every time. Instead of using the law, they collectively bargained their way to free agency. Flood was the only one brave enough to speak up and start that movement. Curt's only remaining connection to baseball was his management of a Little League team.
Major League Baseball owed and owes Flood a huge debt of gratitude that has never fully been paid. Flood's decision to challenge baseball left him unable to support himself or his family. Curt Flood is not in the Hall of Fame and absolutely deserves to be. He stood up and made conditions much better for all players that came after him. He battled his demons for the rest of his life, but he worked hard to achieve his sobriety and reconnect with his children. Curt received the NAACP Jackie Robinson Award in 1987. One of the only acknowledgments Flood ever got from players that he had done the right thing came 25 years after he sued baseball, when he spoke to the Players Association just before they had a strike in 1994. He spoke on solidarity and fighting the tough fight. They gave him the standing ovation that he deserved so many years ago.
Flood died in 1997 at just the age of 59. Flood fought through extreme adversity to stand up for his principles, and he deserves to be remembered as more than just the man who sued baseball. Behind Jackie Robinson, he is the most important athlete in American history. His impact on the business of sports is incalculable. Flood has not done well in the balloting to be elected into the Hall of Fame. 1977 was Curt's first year on the ballot after retiring in 71, and that year he received 4% of the votes. In 1978, 2%. In 1979, 3%. In its own way, baseball still holds a grudge. I wish I could tell you that the power was wrested from the owners and players are now sharing equally in the booming profits of baseball. Don't believe the articles that say baseball is dying and the American pastime is wilting. There was a player strike less than 2 years ago, and MLB still posted an overall income of over $10.3 billion in 2022. More Americans bought tickets to MLB games last year than the NHL, NFL, or NBA combined. The newly added pitch clock has more fans tuning in, and for longer. Franchises are worth more than they've ever been. The Yankees alone are valued at more than $7 billion. Oakland A's owner John Fisher bought the club in 2005 for just $180 million, and the franchise is worth 10 times that now. Despite incredible profits, with a scrape-to-the-bone payroll over the last few years, Fisher denied giving minor league players a $400 a month stipend while the pandemic season was on hold, considering the financial circumstances, while at the same time funneling $5 million to a conservative dark money group. Fisher has been pitting the city of Oakland against the fans and the other owners to leverage the team out of town. When Oakland fans staged a reverse boycott and packed the stadium to show their support of the team, Commissioner Rob Manfred retorted,
"It's great to see what is this year, almost an average Major League Baseball crowd in the facility for one night. That's a great thing."
Did you watch the A's game on Tuesday?
I was actually at a dinner with the owners.
Eat shit, Manfred. But hey, they got the pitch clock right.
And we're from Denver, so you know there's no way we're getting out of this without talking about Rockies owner Dick Monfort. Richard L. Monfort is the heir to the feudal lords of the mid-20th century. Dick Monfort went to the same school as we did, the University of Northern Colorado in Greeley in Weld County, Colorado. Him and his brother Charlie were born into a meatpacking dynasty that started about 100 years ago, which honestly deserves its own video for how much they strangle the options of family farms and ranchers. Monfort's ownership has come to be defined by penny pinching and refusing to adapt to analytics and the modern approach to baseball, while using his front office staff as clubhouse attendants, doing laundry and shining shoes. He'll put money into a new rooftop bar, but would never take a run at a free agent star pitcher in their prime. While the Rockies have maybe the best ballpark in the entire league, and yes, I've been to both Wrigley and Camden, the team ownership has been deeply, deeply incompetent.
The Rockies only had 5 winning seasons in the last 20 years, regularly putting what is essentially a AAA team on the field and paying $50 million to help ship a generational third baseman to another team. Did that translate to low ticket sales and punishment by the fans? Nope. The Rockies repeatedly score in the top 10 of attendance numbers. What Monfort does well, just like the feudal lords of the past, is business. What matters is that tickets get sold, and when you have a beautiful downtown ballpark, Rocky Mountain sunsets, and tachos, why would you ever develop your players or invest in baseball operations? Monfort treats his franchise like a real estate venture, not a baseball team. He has no incentive to deliver a good product on the field or join other franchises in modernity. His message to the fans is, I don't care. But he will occasionally personally respond to fan emails. As we write this at the All-Star break of the 2023 season, the Rockies are 18 games out of first place and have been outscored by 142 runs. We don't really watch the Rockies anymore.
Yes, baseball players are making more money than ever. They're signing long deals worth hundreds of millions of dollars. But the owners are still winning. Most teams are worth over $2 billion, despite the fact that only a handful of teams are actually competing and spending money on players each year. Regional sports network deals black out viewing of games for most fans while pocketing huge piles of cash for exclusive rights to show games. Right now, a regional sports network, or RSN, pays a team for the right to broadcast their games. A distributor like Time Warner or Spectrum then pays the RSN for the right to distribute the RSN. Manfred himself admits that they signed away exclusive rights to distributors who never distributed the product. A paltry 15% of homes in the St. Louis area have access to watching Cardinals baseball games. If you want to watch the Cards, you have to pay for cable. I'm a 31-year-old millennial. I don't know anyone under 40 who pays for cable. MLB is currently kicking the tires on a league-wide broadcasting deal owned by MLB, giving more power to owners over what is said and how it is said on its networks. This seems like an interesting opportunity for the owners to gain even more control. As opposed to being subject to the fair criticism that is often levied by ESPN personalities like Jeff Passan or Buster Olney, MLB could go right over their heads. Legally and financially, MLB is years away from making that happen, but you never know.
America's labor history is reflected in baseball. Workers fighting for the benefits they earned, whether it was to be paid in money or to have weekends off. Workers have labored tirelessly for millionaires and billionaires to reluctantly turn over a pittance for money and control. Owners are still working to pocket more profits, have the public pay for stadiums with tax dollars, and shave money off in high-dollar TV deals. It's way past the time to put Curt Flood in Cooperstown so he can be properly honored for what he did for modern athletes. Flood stood up for what he believed was right, and it cost him most of his life and his livelihood.
We're currently watching Hollywood writers and actors join hands in fighting not for fortunes, but for enough money to pay their rent and to put their child in Little League. How have the executives responded? Let them starve. Let them lose their homes. We unequivocally support the strikers. They should get what they've already earned. As the state of labor continues to evolve in the US, we're hoping that people support the players, or the writers or the actors, instead of the owners and executives. Jackie Robinson embraced Curt Flood. It's time we all did too.